Welcome back, welcome back. This week, the US House of Representatives upheld a presidential veto of a bill to prevent the CIA from using techniques like that known as waterboarding, where the victim thinks he's drowning, on suspects. President Bush said that the legislation would have taken away one of the most valuable tools in the war on terror. But does torture really work? And more importantly, perhaps, can it ever be morally acceptable to willfully inflict pain on another human being for the purposes of obtaining information? I'm joined today by the legendary lawyer, Professor Alan Dershowitz of Harvard Law School, who says that in extreme circumstances, he says that very firmly, extreme circumstances, the use of torture can be justified. Alan, could you begin by just explaining to us your ticking bomb, as it were, scenario where torture could possibly be justified?
Let me first put the problem of torture in context. Torture is routine and widespread against political opponents and political dissidents in Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Philippines, Pakistan, Iran, and nearly every Arab and Muslim state in the world. It is not used by democracies, by the United States, by European countries, by Israel, except in extraordinary cases where there is a ticking bomb situation where the failure to torture, at least believed by the intelligence agencies, may result in tens, hundreds, or thousands of people being killed. So let's put that in a proper context. Now, my own personal view is I'm against torture, even in the ticking bomb situation. Were I in charge of a country, I would never use it. But it is being used. It was used by England. It was used by France. It is used by the United States. It has been used by Israel in ticking bomb situations. Because it's been used, I want to constrain and control its use and make sure it's used, if it's used at all, only in extraordinary situations. That's why I would require a ticking bomb warrant. That is, the Chief Justice of the country would have to sign a warrant prepared by the President or the Prime Minister indicating that an extraordinary situation exists, warranting non-lethal forms of torture. So that's my ticking bomb torture warrant proposal.
The situation that therefore confuses people is this: how do you know that any one situation is one where torture is definitely justified? How can you be sure you're not torturing an innocent man?
Unless you can prove to the Chief Justice by hard evidence, the warrant would be turned down. But let's compare that to the current situation. Today, all you need is some low-ranking official who believes or suspects that somebody might conceivably have information, and they are today being tortured. So my proposal improves the situation. It makes it much, much harder to get a warrant and makes it less likely that you'll get mistaken situations. We do know that torture has worked on several occasions to prevent ticking bombs from going off. A famous case in the Philippines where a person was tortured and revealed a plot to kill the Pope and to blow up airplanes across the Pacific Ocean. We know that a kidnapping was foiled in the state of Florida by the use of torture. There are other situations, perhaps not many. That's why I'm against use of torture, and why, if it's used, it should be limited only to the ticking bomb situation where the evidence is completely compelling. For example, where the person brags about it or boasts about it, as happened in Germany not so long ago. A person boasted and bragged that he knew where the boy was who he had kidnapped and who was about to die, and that's when they considered using torture to elicit that information from him.
A lot of people have said that in this particular field, information you get from torture may not be useful or valuable, because the so-called information they give you is unrealistic, because people will make up anything to stop the torture.
I agree with that, and that's why torture should never, under any circumstances, be used to get people to confess crimes, as it is today in Egypt, as it is in Jordan, as it was in the former Soviet Union. Using it to confess crimes or admitting it into evidence absolutely should be prohibited. What we're talking about is that rare situation where you don't ask the person, did you do it, but you ask him to take you to where the bomb is. The only time it's ever useful is in self-proving situations where you don't have to rely on the credibility of the person, because they often will make up anything to avoid the torture. They have to prove to you by taking you to where the bomb is. That's what happened in the case in the Philippines, where the life of the Pope and the life of thousands of people on airplanes was saved.
At the same time, isn't there a danger that torture causes bigger problems? And here we've got to consider the whole hearts and minds thing. I mean, The Economist, for instance, said, liberal democracies need to be better than their enemies. We're losing the world opinion every time we get into this torture situation by proving that we're just as bad as everybody else.
Well, we're not just as bad as anybody else. We did use torture in the Second World War. The British used torture. Torture was common on the battlefield against captured soldiers to get out of them information about where snipers may be, etc. But we don't use it against political opponents. We don't use it against dissidents. If it's used by Western democracies, it's used only in these extraordinary ticking bomb situations. And I think talking about it is better than doing it secretly below the radar screen. It may help public relations to pretend you're not doing it, but with a wink and a nod to prove it. But in a democracy, accountability is absolutely essential. And if we're doing it, we better talk about it. We better do it within the law, not outside the law. In a democracy, nothing should ever be done outside the law. Nothing should be done under the radar screen. The public has to know about it. And talking about it is a very useful way of constraining and controlling it. Even if it loses us some votes for the minds and hearts of other people, in a democracy, accountability is more important.
And the U.S. House of Representatives upheld the veto on the bill this week that would have prevented the CIA from using waterboarding. Was this a shame, a pity, or are you glad?
No, it's a shame and a pity. I was hoping that that law would be upheld. I think we have to have a law that says torture is never going to be used, and then if we want to have an exception, except in the following situations where the president has to sign under oath information, and then the Chief Justice in the United States has to approve that. Such a law I could understand being enacted, but the president's veto simply says that waterboarding, which is torture, no doubt about that, waterboarding will now be permissible by the CIA without rules, without constraints, without the need for a warrant. That's why I am completely opposed to President Bush's veto of the waterboarding prohibition bill.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this conversation. One last question, which is nothing to do with what we've been talking about. We read a lot in the papers here about the possibility of a draft Gore campaign. Is it legally possible that he could be the Democratic candidate in this year's presidential elections?
In politics, anything is legally possible, as Bush versus Gore, the Supreme Court decision of 2000, unfortunately demonstrated. It is not realistic that Gore, who I like very much, would ever be the candidate. I think the Democrats will choose between two extraordinary candidates, two of the best candidates we've ever had. Some people will be dissatisfied, whoever is chosen. But I think in the end, either Hillary Rodham Clinton or Barack Obama, both of whom I know and admire enormously, will be the Democratic candidate, and I hope will be the next president of the United States.
Alan Dershowitz, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.